I'll take just a second to introduce myself. My name is RJ Burnham. I have worked in the world of voice and communications platforms now for over 30 years. Started my first experimentations and playing around with speech recognition was going all the way back to the old Macintalk on the original, early Macintoshes. And I've worked kind of through enterprise communication all the way through there. I was lucky to be very involved in the W3C process for VoiceXML, CCXML, SCXML, and development around that with the Voice Browser Working Group through the 2000s. And have stayed really involved in this all the way through there. And recently I've been very involved in attacking and bringing on generative voice AI agents. We actually released a LLM-powered and developed a LLM-powered voice platform. Actually, before ChatGPT was actually released, we were experimenting. We had seen the LLMs and thought there was great possibility around this. So to me, this has been very exciting. I had actually taken a little bit of I'd moved out of the voice space because I felt kind of, I'll say, a little bit burnt out and frustrated with just the lack of progress. And it's a very exciting time because I think voice is really having renaissance around it. The trick that I kind of want to talk about today is, that I think really matters is how do we bring interoperability back to voice AI without slowing innovation? There's so much going on right now, but it's all happening today inside proprietary technology stacks. And it really brings me back to what I'll say kind of the early days of, I'll say pre-voice XML, when everyone had these ideas of making things programmable, but it was all completely separate systems around us. And the way I kind of look at it is if you're building a voice agent today, there's a lot of the same problems that people are all trying to go through there. There's a bunch of different frameworks. There's different solutions, approaches for it. And it's a moving target. And if you go and build a solution, let's say Core AI, or you go to Consig, or you go to VAPI or Retail, all of these are very powerful frameworks, but they're all different, and they've gone through their approach, trying to solve many of the same problems around guide rails, persona, deterministic, non-deterministic portions of it, each on our own piece. And I think this ultimately drives a real cost. I also think it's a necessary stage of this. We are moving at a very accelerated pace around what is possible, and standards take time. I'll talk a little bit more about this. Standards organizations tend to be very slow moving by design, and because they need to make sure that it's something that's stable and goes through it. But I think we're coming up on a spot now where a lot of the problems actually, there is a convergence around this. And I think there's time to start thinking about how do we standardize and not slow down the innovation around it. So if I look back at the history and around it, and why don't we just use some of the existing stuff? Well, VoiceXML was good for its time, and it was really built around the problem of directed dialogue, structured prompts. Everything was grammar driven. And it was a very deterministic and predictable outcome around this. I don't think anyone had ever thought of the word hallucination in building voice applications at that point. And I do think there's things to learn from this. A lot of folks have just jumped into going all LLM and all generative AI, but that's not always the right tool around this. And this is one of the things I really want to think about as we look at the standards, is learn from some of the pieces that were built out before and how do we adapt it in here. The problem is we've hit and gone through now several different paradigm shifts. For years, and I'll say probably still 90% of the platforms out there are still directed dialogue. Most of the applications we use in a lot of use cases in here are still using that same flow where you're going step by step, one question at a time. In the 2015s era, we started seeing the introduction of things like Dialogflow, Alexa, Siri, where we introduced intent-based technologies. Now, it still actually fit a lot of the traditional design and, if you will, dialogue tools, because typically you're introducing much wider inputs, but it was still constrained and following a flow-based approach that didn't really change how applications were designed. But the problem is once we introduced LLM agents, things really opened up. There no longer was a flow chart that could really represent what happens because it was much more conversational. This allowed great flexibility and interesting solutions, but everybody pretty much threw out what they were doing, or they hammered LLMs into their platform in each sort of independent proprietary way around it. And what I say is looking through this is I don't think we want to bring back voice XML, but I think we want to look at these different pieces and these paradigms and how do we combine the advantages of all of them together. And this gets into one of my elements around it is I do think for modern voice interfaces, it is a hybrid. There's places where you need the deterministic flow of directed dialogue and even of the intent-based places because you may have compliance and regulatory. I do at Consig, we're building in healthcare, and there's a lot of sensitivity around being able to go off the rails. And LLMs are not the right tool for a lot of portions of that. If you think about something like a identity verification or collecting a credit card number, these are workflows that are very easy to do in voice with directed dialogue. And you don't necessarily need LLMs and generative AI to solve that. In fact, they actually kind of complicate this around this. And so this is where I think as we build the frameworks around this, we need to incorporate both. The open-ended generative, on the other hand, is extremely powerful for things like explanation, Q&A, knowledge graphs, being able to ask the open-ended questions. Scheduling is one of the use cases I point to in there that if you tried to build an appointment scheduler in directed dialogue and voice XML, it was a horrible experience, both as a developer trying to make it all work, and then as a user, it was going to drive you nuts as well, because it would just, you would always be asking something that you want to go through it. This is stuff that generative does amazing. And how do we mix both of these things? And I think that's really what we're going to need to define as a standard is how we handle that, both portions of that. We do see some standardization happening around the edges, but nobody has really taken on the core, particularly in voice interactions. There's stuff with MC, you've heard about MCP and A to A around this. These are really good portions around, for example, how to access tools and APIs from elements. And I'm glad to see that there's standardization around that. A to A really starts focusing around how do agents pass tasks back and forth because it's no longer there. And we have a little bit of work around that I'll say that the kind of overlaps is with the works around Agents MD, which actually starts to describe some of the behaviors that you should be going through and picking up this. But nobody's really solved a way to describe a dialogue flow or a path or a transaction that needs, particularly for voice interfaces, and particularly what I see in enterprise elements around this. And I think this is the missing piece of where most of the folks building platforms are trying to experiment, and we're all stomping on this. Now, I'll touch around this fundamentally, I think a challenge. All of these MCP A2A agents, MD, were not created in a standards process. They were kind of created by individual companies that were able to get the mind share. And this is a question I kind of have is what is going to be the right approach for this? I do like that it looks like a lot of this stuff is being handed over to the Agentic AI Foundation as part of Linux Foundation. This is kind of a more recent development. This is a spot that we really need to look at because really we do need standards, but we need to find a way to actually get them developed and move through a process. And whether it's the W3C, the IETF, or maybe the Agentic AI Foundation, I think we need to have multiple companies coming together around it. So what's that portion that I think is missing? It really comes down to, is this flow? How do we define what the outcomes and success of a voice agent is? What's the data that needs to be gathered? What's the tools and APIs that you're integrating into? How do you define what the guardrails and escalation rules, and how do you make sure that there's observability around it? I think observability and audit is one of the things I think VCons bring into the mix of this. I'm excited by the work that's happening over in ITF with that. I think that fits very much into this. But I don't think, a lot of these things don't really have solutions. And if you look at every platform that gets built, they end up trying to build guardrails as some component onto it. That you define, maybe it's a form paradigm, maybe it's a API contract, the document filling pieces. There's a lot of different approaches to this, but we're trying to solve these same core problems over and over again. And that's to me where the opportunity is around this. From my perspective, I think the sweet spot around this is being able to do some sort of semi-structured instructions. What we've found in our experience is just trying to do open-ended prompts with the AI platforms really doesn't work well. You go off the rails, you do not have the control around this. But specifying a lot of it, for example, in JSON or YAML, or bringing a little bit of structure into it where you set up, these are the sections, you can greatly improve the performance around it. What I think is important is that you really want to define, and I think we need to define and spec the outcomes, not the exact conversational journey. And this gets a little bit ahead. There's places where you do need to touch a conversational journey in detail, but a lot of places you do want it open-ended in there. It's kind of the spot. The way I think about it is, how do we give enough instructions like you would to a person? And it really is the same type of problem of how you train a call center agent. If you just tell them, hey, answer the phone and answer customer service questions, they're going to be all over the place. There's going to be no consistency in how it's done. But if you give them and train them with a run book and details around it, and you don't want it to be over detailed. We've all been on the other end of a call center agent that has to go by a playbook and they have a script they have to follow, and it's usually a horrible experience, even with people. I think LLMs and voice agents are very much kind of the same around this. So I think it is a balance of how structured and how tight you want to go through this, but there are places that you need to go through it. I do think having a way to handle the persona, the role, effectively the data gathering portions, this is stuff that we need to go through it. I have opinions about state machines because that is one of the places that people go to. I was one of the original authors of SCXML. It was very, it has a lot of relative elements. There's tools like LangGraph. Humans can't write this. It doesn't work. It's too complicated. I've seen this. I may have some PTSD, but I think these are very, very difficult. I think it's an element that comes into it, but it's really hard to offer. One of the better structures I've seen about this is actually Rasa Calm. This is Rasa is an open source company. They do have commercial stuff. Unfortunately, this is not open source and not done as an open standard, but I think there's some really promising ideas and papers in this paper. And to this is what I think what come back to has, how do we get interest in it? I think we really do need to do some work to evangelize the industry and the leaders in this, whether, from folks like Rasa, from the folks like Vappy, the different platforms that are out there, to get consensus that it's time to build some standards around this. It's tough to go through it. Standards are, if you have a proprietary system that locks your customers into it, it makes it sticky. But I look at what happened in VoiceXML, and by making them open standards, we made the industry so much larger, and we opened up the possibility of programmable communications that never would have happened. I think if you look at platforms like Twilio didn't use VoiceXML, but Twilio I don't think would have existed without VoiceXML along the way on this. And this is where I think some of the opportunities on it. I do think we should be pragmatic and think about the minimal scopes around this, because if we try and bite off everything of a dialogue framework, we will spend years going around it. Maybe it's really starting to define each of those little building blocks that we can put together. How do we define a persona? How do we define the guardrails? How do we define data fields that take both deterministic and non-deterministic structures on it? So that's kind of my thoughts, little pieces of it. I'm not sure we're yet at the spot where this can become a standard, where we can start creating standards, but I think it's time for us to start having these conversations. Customers need to talk to their vendors. We as an industry need to evangelize and convince the rest of the folks building these platforms that there is a value in doing this.